Hello everybody. Today in this video I'm going to discuss the importance of learning languages, especially learning languages through literature. And we usually have a common theme, and that theme is language through literature. Therefore, my first concern is to talk about language through literature. This covers learning languages through literary texts. Usually, there is a new trend in the world to learn languages through literary texts. Of course, in my discussion, I'm going to talk about how we can learn English language through English literary texts. Let us go into details. Now, in this discussion, my first question is, why should we use literary texts to learn a language? Of course, if you are using literary texts, there should be a reason, or there should be reasons. So let me give you some reasons in detail with a kind of background support to this topic. First thing I would like to mention here is literary texts have been used from a very long time in the history of education. Usually, traditional teachers, especially the people who incorporated grammar translation method, use literary texts as examples to the learning of language, especially to the learning of English language. On the other hand, to the teaching of English language. However, this trend was broken when many people rejected grammar translation method. But now, however, we come across, on the other hand, the popularity gained by eclectic approach. Now, in the case of eclectic approach, people do not reject even the traditional approaches, methods like grammar translation method. So they take sometimes the important features of such methodologies. So now, once again, there's a trend, there's an upcoming trend to use literary texts as examples, as base in the case of teaching languages. Let me take some examples. Now, I would like to take Stern 1985. According to this contribution, he says English and American literature have been part of the non-English speaking countries' curriculum for several years, more than 100 years, as this slide says. However, what we have to understand here is that people in general have used literary texts in the case of teaching languages, especially teaching English language. Why is this? Why do you think they have used it? Reason is usually non-native speakers of English, like us, like Sri Lankans, we have no exposure to the real English context, real English usage. So where can we get such usage? Where can we get such exposure? Of course, we have either uh, uh, get a chance to visit such countries, or else we should actually, the second best way is to associate literary texts. Therefore, I think personally, Stern's argument is supporting my view. My view is, if you can't go and live in that particular language context, the second best way is to associate what is written in literature closely. We can have closer examples closer relationships with the particular language if we have literary texts, or if we use, in other words, literary texts in teaching language. Let me take you to another study. According to Duff 1990, uh, this idea is brought out. Literary texts in the target language were used as examples of good writing and good illustration of grammatical rules. So what is good is a questionable thing here. Usually it is believed when literary texts are produced by the native speakers or speakers of that particular language who have a very good background, academically very sound knowledge, will produce exemplary texts, and we can consider such texts as good writing. So when we want to show examples to our students, it's always better to quote and show literary texts to those students. They will take them as good writing. Of course, this is open for dialogue, this is open for arguments, but rather than not using literary texts, I think it is better to have some examples of well-written language that is found in literature. Also, grammatical rules, for example. We come across rules of grammar in any given language. Language, on the other hand, is based upon rules. So these rules are very often practically used in literary texts. Maybe our students do not get a chance to associate native speakers using grammar, using English language. Then, of course, we can use the second best way to find examples that are written in literary texts. Of course, one can argue here, on the other hand, writers or the literary text writers sometimes do not go by 100% accurate grammatical rules. There is an argument for that. However, we have so many accurate examples of grammar in literary texts. I point out those things. Of course, let us continue with the same argument. Now, I would like to once again take examples from Ahrens and Sofa 2000. They emphasize the importance of literary texts as reading materials. Let me talk about reading materials. English language, just like any other language, has 4 skills. Reading is one of the most important skills, just like speaking. Of course, speaking is a productive skill. Reading is generally considered as a receptive skill. However, when learning a language, reading is supporting the learner immensely. Maybe you have heard, reading maketh a man. So, I propose the use of literary text as reading materials is one of the best things that we can do as teachers of English in order to teach language. Of course, the second point highlighted in my slide is that they provide culturally authentic texts. Now, usually literature is produced in a particular country, in a particular culture. We of course learn the features of that culture when we read maybe the novel, maybe the short story, maybe the poem, whatever it is. From where are we getting that culturally authentic texts. Of course, we get them from the written literature of that particular language. Now, for example, as a Sri Lankan, I usually take examples from English writers, especially native speakers writing. I'll take as examples for my students to use them in their classes, for my students to take as examples, because I always believe the language produced by native speakers are usually natural, are usually are used. Of course, I'm referring to languages actually, not only English language. But if you take English, for example, English English is actually very well used in a real way, in a very natural way by the English writers. I mean, English native writers. So why don't we use them? Why don't we take examples from such texts to teach English either as ESL, ESL means English as a second language, or even as EFL. EFL means English as a foreign language. Let me continue. Further, I would like to take the argument presented by Van 2009. According to him, literature provides meaningful contexts. Why do I say meaningful? I like this comment. Usually, how language is meaningful to another person, say for example English, how English can be meaningful to us. We should experience it and see the real meaning of that language. How can we see the real meaning of that language? We cannot see that in isolation. We cannot see that in isolated sentences. We can only see it in realistic situations, or in other words, the second best way is in the kind of really created, genuinely created literary texts. Their language is operated in a kind of meaningful context. So why don't we use language that has been used in such contexts? Of course, we come across rich descriptive language. Of course, one can argue we usually come across rich descriptive written language in literature. Of course, true, but sometimes it's not 100% written language. Even the spoken language is written in dialogue forms in language and in literary texts. Therefore, good teacher is mindful, is careful, is open for such users. For example, he or she can find good literary texts where the language is used meaningfully, also where the language is used for very good descriptions. Why not? Why not we take such examples from literature? Also, let me continue the argument further. There are many other people who supported this argument. Some people say this is the best way to get L2 vocabulary knowledge, second language vocabulary knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, vocabulary is considered as the building blocks of any given language. So if you want to learn English, for example, you need to have a rich vocabulary of English language. Of course, we can find vocabulary in dictionaries, but meaningless. But when we find the vocabulary items used in meaningful context in literature, that is a kind of interesting experience, interesting reading experience for you. And such words you learn through literary texts will remain with you for a long time. Not only individual words, the lexical phrases, of course, lexis are words, but words are organized into phrases, fixed expressions. We call formulaic expressions. Such formulaic expressions we come across in literature, and they are very memorable, and they are used in our day-to-day conversations. Say, for example, when Shakespeare says whole world is a stage, all men and women are players on it, he uses such common lexical phrases, and those phrases have become phrases used everywhere in the world today. When Wordsworth says, child is the father of man, in his poetry, of course, we use them now as a praise. We say, child is the father of man. From where did we get this praise? We got it from literary texts. Also, on the other hand, as I mentioned previously, we have other people supporting the idea of learning grammar through literary texts. I'm not going to talk about it now here in detail because I previously pointed out that point. Of course, last point in my slide here, social linguistics and pragmatic competencies. McKay 2001 points out that literary texts can provide social linguistics and pragmatic competencies in learning a language. What is this? Language is always a social phenomenon. Language is usually operated in society. Therefore, where can we see examples of social language? Of course, you can see social language when you are living in the society. But if you are non-native speaker, if you cannot live in the society, how can you learn it? The second best way is to associate literature. The second point, the pragmatic competencies. What is pragmatic? Pragmatism means the use of language. Where can we see the real examples of the use of language? Of course, that is in the society. We can see how people use language. But as Sri Lankans, as Indians, as Bangladeshis, as Japanese people find it difficult to see real pragmatic examples of English language. So I propose for those people to associate literary texts. There they can see pragmatic examples of English language that is used. Let me continue. I would like to talk here to support my background. I'll be taking 6 points to prove that language can be taught by using literary texts. My first point is universality. Universal applications. Because literature is usually a universal phenomenon. This is, of course, the topics used, topics taken by writers are usually global level, or in other words, universal level. For example, love, death, separation, jealousy, pride. All these things are common to Sri Lankans, common to Indians, common to Africans, common to British people, common to Americans. So, where can we find such common themes, such universal themes? Of course, the best place, to my experience, is we find such universal themes in literary texts. Therefore, whenever you want to talk about such issues with your students to show examples, why not use literary texts? Let me take another point. That is authenticity. Usually, authenticity, authentic language is promoted in communicative language teaching. We always advise our teachers to use authentic texts, authentic materials in teaching English language. Where can we find authentic texts? Of course, there are many authentic texts. Even if you take, for example, railway timetable, that's an authentic text. If you talk about weather report, that's an authentic text. They are there, but very methodical, very organized, very well written, authentic text we come across amply in literature. My argument is, why don't we use such beautifully written authentic texts to teach English language? For example, we can use them to teach grammar, we can use them to teach words, we can use them, you can use takes our authentic text to use them as reading texts in our language classroom. Therefore, literature usually provides you with genuine, authentic input whenever you make use of them. Usually now, on my slide, you can read most of the traditional forms of language input tend to introduce language artificial. Usually we come across artificial language, but in literature, we do not find artificial language. We find language used in authentic contexts. Let me take you to the next point. My third point for this discussion is personal relevance. Whenever you are reading a literary text, whenever you are watching a film, whenever you are uh, uh, watching a drama, for example, what you hear, what you see, what you experience is something personal to you. You become part of the novel you are reading. You become part of the film you are watching. Then the language that is in operation also becomes part of you. And that is a good contribution for language learning if you think deeply. Let me take an example. Whenever you are reading, you are not reading only the text that you have in front of you. You associate the knowledge that you have already gained on that particular subject matter. Now in this slide, you can say a real imaginative part of reader's experience is supporting, is actually contributing for your reading. Now, personally, you have gained certain knowledge, for example, about love, certain knowledge, for example, hatred, certain knowledge, for example, jealousy. You have in you, we call it your schema, and there's something called schema theory. The schema that you have in your brain is supporting the current reading that you are experiencing, the current text that you are reading. Because to get the meaning of the text, you are mixing your contribution, your schema knowledge, your schema contribution. From where do you get that? Of course, you get, I can't tell and finish the sources that you get your experience, sources that you get your get your schema developed. However, whenever a text become a part of you, when you have something from you to contribute, it easily uh, becomes a part of your life. Maybe the film you watch, maybe the drama you watch becomes part of your life. Then you enjoy it better. And this factor very often we come across in literary texts. Therefore, usually we have personal relevance in literary texts. Why don't we use it? Why don't we use it meaningfully in teaching languages? Especially if it is English literary text, why don't we use personal relevance of literary personal relevance that we can come across in literary text in the case of teaching English language? Continuation. Item 4 I'm discussing is stimulating nature of literary texts. Literary texts are usually, stimulating people to the texts, to the language. Now literary texts are very often intellectually stimulating. It talks to our intellect. The literature talks to our intellect. Usually, world famous literary texts are so famous, are so respected by people. Why? They are intellectually stimulating people in general. So we have a world of literature. We have a world of, say, maybe depending on the drama, world of love, world of jealousy, world of hatred. If we are in that particular literary text, and that stimulates you to be in it, you to live in it. Of course, if you are learning a language, you have to live in it. You have to associate it so close to your heart and mind. Then you automatically learn it. So from where do you get such qualities? From where do you get such examples? One best place is literary text, ladies and gentlemen. Let me take you to the next point. It is variety. When we talk about literary texts, usually we have a very clear variety of texts. Maybe poems, maybe short stories, maybe novels, maybe dramas, whatever it is. All these varieties will provide people a chance to explore different type of genres. Say, for example, poems are taken as one genre of literature. There are some people who personally like poems. Let them use the language in poetry to learn that particular language. Other people love to read dialogues in dramas. Why can't we allow them to take such dialogues as learning grounds, as learning kind of techniques, learning material on the other hand, for their personal learning? So my fifth point for discussion today is this. Let me take you to the last point for discussion today. Generally, literary texts are interesting. Because they are interesting, only they are famous. Because they are interesting, only people love them. Because they are interesting, only they have become long-lasting experience for people. Now this is, as this slide says, global human experience. They are intrinsically interesting for readers. Say sometimes, say uh, English novels, say Russian novels, say for example Sinhalese novels, Indian novels, whatever the language. On the other hand, we have this global human interest in those literary texts. So if your focus is English language, take good literary text written in that language. Of course, the topics used in that language in literature are common to everybody in the world. So in other words, they are related to global human experience. Therefore, it is very meaningful for people who are learning that language. Ladies and gentlemen, today my discussion was in general to give you an idea why we should use literary texts in teaching languages. Especially my focus was on teaching English as a second language. When teaching, I propose English as a second language, we can use English literary texts. Of course, traditionally this system was accepted by people in general because people those days respected grammar translation method. But it became less popular later on in the history of language teaching. The moment it lost its position in the teaching of English language, people went away from literary texts. However, now, once again, with the popularity taken by eclectic approach to teach languages, especially eclectic approach to teach English language, we now see people once again take the positive points of grammar translation method into consideration. So now I see a kind of green light once again in the use of English literary texts in the case of teaching English language, especially teaching English as a second language. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I have tried to give you some idea about this topic today, and I welcome your comments. I welcome your valuable ideas. Of course, this is not the end of this discussion. We should continue this discussion further, and of course, we should research into this area to give the world a kind of real, solid area of knowledge with regard to the use of literary texts in teaching languages. Thank you very much.